have the honor to be sitting here with Dr. Colin Campbell, who is one of the most distinguished nutritional biochemists in the world. This is the first in a series of interviews that we'll be doing with Dr. Campbell that are hopefully going to cover his life and not just his scientific work, but also I'm very interested in sort of probing your background and to see how your development as a person influenced you as a scientist. So.
You might know more about me than I know about myself.
The first topic we're going to be talking about is your early life, your childhood on when and how you grew up and the lessons you learned at that time. But before we get to that, a lot of people tend to use the term whole food plant-based diet and vegan interchangeably. And could you explain why that's not true?
Well, first off, I talk about a whole food plant-based diet, meaning what the words say, based on science from my perspective. But that sounds something like vegetarian diets. The problem with the vegetarian word and practice is that 90% of vegetarians are still using dairy. And oftentimes, maybe a little chicken, a little fish, call themselves vegetarians. The vegan, in turn, is a diet that, yes, they're not consuming animal-based foods for sure, but what they do instead is they're consuming really high levels of fat. So the average fat content of a vegan diet is around 30%, according to the latest figures. So they're using a lot of processed foods, high in sugar, salt, fat, whatever. And their diets are, marginally better, one could argue, but in reality, not that much better because they're not eating the foods that really count any more than the omnivore to some
And why is a whole food plant-based diet? Why is that qualitatively better?
Well, that's really focused on the foods that matter.
Right.
Reading whole foods with a particular emphasis on vegetables and fruits and so forth, because they're loaded with antioxidants, they're loaded with complex carbohydrates. And over here, the vegan diet, vegetarian diet, and meat diet, if you will, they're also all deficient in these antioxidants and complex carbohydrates.
Okay. So
that's very different.
What's the difference between a complex carbohydrate and a simple carbohydrate?
Well, carbohydrate, first off, is primarily produced only by plants. It's part of the whole process of capturing energy from the sun. But those carbohydrates become very, very complex chemically, very complex, and long polymers of, the single units. And they also get mixed up with other kinds of things. So we end up with things like dietary fiber and, all that's carbohydrate, essentially. It's that class of things, and it's a form in which the energy of the sun has been captured into the chemical bonds, and so a lot of the energy is in that carbohydrate. Eventually, some of that gets stored in fat, even more concentrated form, but the carbohydrate is very complex stuff, almost infinitely complex. And it just has some general chemical properties that we can talk about a class of foods, and that's where I argue, that 80% of our total energy intake should be from the carbohydrates.
Okay.
That's a complex kind. Refined, you're taking them out.
Simple carbohydrates.
Making sugar out of them in white
much
flour.
more refined.
Yeah. Right.
Like white flour, for instance.
And it's not natural.
Whole wheat flour.
And it's not natural.
Yeah.